Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And in this episode, I want to talk about escalation. I want to talk about the possibility that the war could widen and how that would look. So obviously on the ground in Ukraine, in terms of what the West, the United States, other Western nation states, is providing to the Ukrainians, the war is escalating. So at the start of the conflict, there was no real discussion or prospect that the Ukrainians would receive main battle tanks, Patriot air defense systems, HIMARS, long-range, multiple launch rocket systems. None of that was on the table. It was discussed in vagity, but again, it wasn't really looked at realistically. And slowly but surely, we have seen the conflict escalate to now where we're seeing those weapon systems being handed over. So what is the next weapon system that just a few months ago was without question would not be handed over to the Ukrainians, now in all probability will? Well, we're seeing the deployment of the ground launch, a small diameter bomb. Those assets will be able to hit deep inside of Russia proper. They will be able to strike targets in Crimea. And more importantly, the possibility of ATACMS. And at the same time, the Ukrainians have their own systems as well. The Ukrainians have had a fairly thriving defense industry. It has gone underground. In all probability, some of those systems are now even being manufactured in the West and then sent back into Ukraine to be deployed as Ukrainian weapon systems. That is happening. So, again, escalation. Now, if the West continues to escalate, continues to provide weapon systems, continues to conduct a proxy war against Russia, which it is doing, and again, the reason for that was the Russian military invasion of Ukraine. Now, is it possible that the Russians could escalate this conflict? Could they start to use other types of weapon systems? Could we see the conflict broaden to other areas? So, if the conflict were to, again, escalate and go into other areas of the world, which is possible. Again, we're seeing countries such as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the Baltic states that really lack any ability to truly protect themselves from an all-out invasion by Russia, I would say being fairly antagonistic in terms of rhetoric, in terms of actions, in terms of handing over weapon systems to the Ukrainians that they probably need for their own self-protection and preservation. So could the Russians launch some sort of operation into the Baltics successfully? Absolutely. Absolutely. And don't think for a second, because of the Russian perceived lack of success in Ukraine, and there has been lack of success. There has been military goals, military objectives that the Russians have not been able to accomplish. But does that mean that a Russian military action against the Baltics would look the same? No, it wouldn't. The Ukrainian military, at the onset of hostilities, was much bigger. Many, many, many times bigger, much more experienced, better prepared than the Baltic states. The Baltic states probably have a capability equivalent to 3 Ukrainian brigades. Think about that for a second. 3 Ukrainian brigades. And I'm just giving a rough estimate so you can compare and contrast. So again, if the Russians decide to make a move against the Baltic states, yes, absolutely, they probably would be successful. Now, what could the West do? Is the West going to move troops into the Baltics? How are they going to get there? Well, the only route, the only safe route for the West to transfer forces is through Poland, through this very narrow gap here, the Suwalki Gap. The Russians would have the ability to saturate this area with long-range fires. Multiple launch rocket systems, cruise missiles. Aircraft could be a problem for the Russians. However, the Russians would forward deploy S-400s, S-300s, and all probability even S-500s at this point. In which case, we would start to see an active shooting war. Russia against Poland, Russia against the United States. In other areas of the world, you would see U.S. assets start to get targeted by Russian capability. Russia has a global capability, especially with their nuclear attack submarines and nuclear cruise missile submarines. Not to mention the array of conventional submarines they have as well. Now, would ultimately the Russians be successful? Would the United States eventually be able to hunt down these submarines? Yes, they would, but at a cost. And then the question is how much cost is the West willing to bear? Would the West launch a ground military operation into the Baltics or some other area where the conflict is heating up? Could the West launch airstrikes against Russia? Yes, they could. But again, it would come at a cost. The Russians would attack Western targets with their own long-range cruise missiles as well. So that's how this conflict could escalate into something the world in all probability does not want. But that's where we are heading right now. Again, we are more likely now that Russia and the West will have some sort of exchange of military fire. Some sort of conflict could develop. Now, furthermore, the prospect of Russia taking revenge. Based on the amounts of personnel that the Russians have lost in this conflict. And yes, it has been relatively high for both sides. It is a brutal conflict, both in military losses of life and civilian losses of life. I can assure you, without a reasonable doubt, that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service is actively preparing for some sort of foreign hostility against the United States and or its interest, either by proxy or directly with Russian assets. It's going to happen. Again, the relationship that now exists between Russia and the West, the United States, is 100 times worse, and now it's kinetic, than what it was just a year ago, or a year and a half ago. And many, many, many 1,000 times worse than what it was just 2 to 3 years ago. So as we see this clamor for support for the Ukrainians, and I get it, I understand. For many of you, it's this perceived black and white issue of right and wrong. One nation state has invaded another. But again, there's more to it than that. The mainstream media in the United States would have you believe that's what it is. Black, white, Russia invaded Ukraine. But if you dive deeper, there are other issues at hand that you have to look at. And you have to look at very closely. And you have to try to put yourself in the shoes of Russia. I know that's difficult. And obviously I will be called the voice of Russia for saying this. But it's important to do. So that's what I have for today. we will continue to watch as the Russians prepare for this, what could be a very large offensive operation against Ukrainian forces to roll up quite possibly the right flank of the Ukrainian military in the eastern Donbass, possibly elsewhere as well. Would not write off the prospect of a surprise happening. So we'll have more very, very soon. Thank you for joining us today. Have a good day.